So, during the holidays, sometimes I don't know about you, but every once in a while, I don't watch a lot of TV, but I will sometimes put in a movie and watch different classics. And so you'll see that the message this morning has at least its genesis in a movie that I watched here not long ago. But it has its basis in the text taken from Joshua chapter 4, verses 6 and 7. Thank you, Elliot, for following along. In the future, your children will ask you, what do these stones mean? Then you can tell them. They remind us that the Jordan River stopped flowing when the Ark of the Lord's covenant went across. These stones will stand as a memorial among the people of Israel. And I've titled this message, Looking Backwards into the Future, because I think it is somewhat Thanksgiving-based. We use Thanksgiving to look backward at God's blessings from the past year. We ask for his blessings moving forward. It acts as an annual reminder to us that we need to be thankful for what we have. But the picture that you see up there is Tevye. And not long ago, I watched Fiddler on the Roof. And it's a story that I think kind of fits current circumstances. It's a story about social turmoil. And this kind of turmoil would soon break out into the Russian Revolution. But Tevye, who's the main character in the story, doesn't know what this is leading to. He doesn't understand that it's going to break out in revolution. He only senses that the world for him is changing. And he's got to find a way to balance who he is with what he believes against the realities of this changing world that he's observing happening around him. Because for him, traditions like Thanksgiving give a stability to life. It's an anchor point that can be touched by the prejudices of people around him, can't be touched by the persecutions of his faith, and can't be touched even by the shifting whims of political leadership. We don't hear a lot of talk about traditions today, at least in a good way. In fact, in our nation, and even in many churches, the word tradition is used in a negative sense. It's used to describe old, dead ways that stifle growth. It describes a lifeless past and is often contrasted with the new and the freer ways of the present. Yet, the emphasis on present experience makes it difficult, I think, at least at times, for us to understand the significance and the power of past encounters that all of us have had with God. Many of the questions we face today are the same ones that Tevye faced in his day during the Fiddler on the Roof. So how, like Tevye, do we respond to a changing world? How do we balance our experience of the past with a world that didn't even exist 5 years ago? How do we teach our children what's important when so much is changing so rapidly around them and us? How do we maintain a moral and a spiritual balance amid the relativism of our modern culture? How do we face an unknown future? The crossing of the Jordan River takes 2 chapters at the beginning of the book of Joshua, to which I only excerpted 2 verses. So if you have the time and opportunity, I'd encourage you to go back and read that Old Testament book. But the people have prepared for their entry now into the land by sending out spies And they've been assured by both the spies and by God that it's safe and that they'll be able to enter that land successfully. Now, normally, the Jordan is a relatively small river that can be crossed pretty easily. However, during the springtime, melting snows in the mountains turn the Jordan River into an absolute torrent, spreading out over the floodplains of the Jordan Valley, and in some cases it can stretch to be a mile wide. But Joshua assured the people that God was about to do something miraculous so that they might know that he was their God and that he was with them. Now, undeniably, the crossing of the Jordan River is the central event of those two chapters. But throughout the story, there's this added dimension that at least catches my attention. And that added dimension is rocks. Rocks. Rocks form a very important part of this story. The people take stones from the river and place them in a great big heap on the riverbank. And the end of the story is not so much crossing the river, but the pile of rocks and what they raise in terms of the significance that these rocks play. Now, of all the things the people could have done, why did they heap up a pile of rocks on the side of the Jordan? And the answer is they did that because the stones were to be a memorial of that particular event, so that when those who came later and saw the stones and asked about them, the story of God's great act for his people could be told yet again. And the story is told for a specific reason. It's not just a story about national origins or something strange to entertain the kids. No, they're to tell the story so that later generations would know that God is and would know what God can do. Sometimes even the ones who've witnessed God's actions firsthand need a reminder. Don't we all? And if we're not careful, this event simply becomes a memorial to something that happened a long, long time ago. It has little meaning to us beyond saying, yeah, that was cool. That was a nice story. And in that way, the rocks simply become another cold, lifeless monument to the past. So what then was so critical about this particular pile of rocks for the Israelites? Why was it so important that the people were to retell the story and to then know its meaning? It's because the Israelites will go on and they will enter into the promised land, but it's not going to be easy. As they move away from the Jordan River, things will never, ever be the same again. Most of them were born in the desert, and they've lived their whole life in the desert. They know the desert very well. But now they're moving into an unknown land with an equally unknown future. They will face extremely well-fortified cities, on foot and armed basically with garden tools for weapons. They'll face fierce chariot-mounted Philistines with an iron arsenal. Untrained in warfare, they will be outnumbered by skilled Canaanite warriors that will confront them. And worst of all, They'll encounter the religions of the Canaanites and be lured into the worship of their god, whose name was Baal, B-A-A-L. In other words, church, they're moving into a land in which they are going to be tempted to forget about God. They face a rough future for sure, but God is going to help them. And as you read through the Bible, you see that Jericho's walls will eventually come down. At Gibeon, the sun will stand still for Joshua. Gideon will rout the Midianite army with 300 men and clay pots. And Goliath will be killed by David. God will do great, great things for his people. But in between the great acts of God, the people will live in a very real world. They'll have to grapple with the day-to-day responsibilities of just living. And they'll get discouraged because after the great victory at Jericho, where the walls came tumbling down, they will suffer their defeat at Ai. After the miracle at Gibeon, where the sun stood still, will come the failures that are recorded in the opening chapters of the Old Testament book of Judges. And after Gideon defeats the Midianites with the 300 soldiers and the clay pots, he'll turn to building idols to Baal. And after David kills Goliath, he'll have Uriah killed to hide his adultery. There will be times, as you read through the Old Testament record, when they will not be sure if God is even present among them, asking, where's God? There'll be times of defeat. There'll be times of discouragement. There'll be times of absolute despair. There'll be no time where miracles will be performed. There will be times when their world is thrown into such chaos that they will be able to not see a future at all. And it's in those times that they will need a reference point. When they can't prove God's existence by their experience, and when they don't know how to adapt to a changing world around them, they'll need to be able to look back and know from past encounters that God is, well, God. They will need an anchor point. And this pile of stones was to be that anchor point for them, a point of reference for later times when the path wouldn't be so clear. These stones were more than a pile of rocks on the bank of a river. These stones were a heritage. They were a tradition. These stones were the fiddler on the roof, so to speak. The tradition that balances the known past with a very unknown future. They were to become a beacon that shined far, far beyond the banks of the Jordan River, far beyond the time of Joshua, and tell far more than just the parting of the Jordan's waters at that location. They were to be a signpost from the past pointing to the future. They were to be a marker by which they could stand in the present, they could look to their past, and then draw a straight line to the future. They were a way to define the present and the future by means of the past. And these people, they can't know where to go until they know where they are. And they can't know where they are until they know where they've been. Does that sound familiar? Because substitute yourself in their place. You can't know where to go, church, until you know where you are. And you can't know where you are until you know from whence you've been. You see, our problem is that once we get out into the middle of life, we need a point of reference. Although we may know generally where we're going, we can't always see how we're going to get there. However, we can see where we've been. So we use the reference point of the miracles of our past as a guide to the future. Do you see the significance of the story? This pile of rocks was this anchor point. They told the people where they had been. They told them who God was. And they told them what God could do. Those stones allowed them to draw a straight line from the past acts of God into their uncertain present and then beyond. And it will be a long journey between the Exodus and the crossing of the Jordan River. In that gap between these great manifestations of God in history, the people will have to live in a real world. They'll experience times when they won't be able to see by their present experiences that God is God at all. There'll be times when they won't be sure if God is even there. So in those times, they need an anchor point. When they can't prove God's presence by their present experience, they'll be able to look back. And they know from their past encounters that God is most definitely God. Now, we didn't read this section, but I would encourage you to read the first 4 chapters of the book of Joshua that tells this story. But I'm putting up here an excerpt for you. It's taken from Joshua chapter 4, verse 23. And here's what it says. Joshua speaking to the people, "Yes, God, your God, dried up the Jordan's waters for you until you had crossed, just as God dried up before us the Red Sea, which had dried up before us until we had crossed." Kind of misread that. Let me start again. Joshua speaking to all the people he is leading. "Yes, God, your God, dried up the Jordan's waters for you until you had crossed, just as God, your God, did at the Red Sea, which had dried up before us until we had crossed." Now, taken out of context, that may not sound that important to you. But please consider the people to whom Joshua is speaking. The curious thing about this passage is that the people to whom Joshua is speaking didn't actually cross the Red Sea with Moses. Either their parents or their grandparents did. So they weren't just remembering their heritage, they were living their heritage. Do you see? Joshua is pointing out to them in the present, yes, he blessed you by allowing you to cross the Jordan, but don't forget that he allowed essentially your parents and your grandparents to do the same across the Red Sea. So it's not just their heritage, it's living their heritage. They'd drawn a straight line from the Exodus through that pile of rocks on the banks of the Jordan and on into an uncertain future. So, how do we, this church, you as individuals, how do we face the uncertainty of a future that we cannot control? In a world that is not of our own making, and in the face of events that we cannot physically bend to our will. We can't always see God in miraculous ways. I mean, we know that He's there, but we don't always know what decisions to make because we don't know how things are going to turn out. Events change too fast. So how do we face a future that we cannot imagine? We look back at the heritage of the Red Sea. We look back at a pile of rocks on the bank of the Jordan River, and we listen to those who have told us about an empty tomb. And so, before we knew firsthand for ourselves, we saw that pile of rocks and learned the lessons of heritage and tradition. Not the stale tradition of facts and ritual, but the tradition of living encounters with God, the heritage of living stones that speak to us of God and His work in the lives of His people. We can look at our piles of stones and draw a line from them to where we are so that we can understand how we got here, and then we can better understand who we are and what we must do to get there. So our task is to take that line drawn through those pile of rocks in the past and extend it into the future about which we are uncertain. But it is a future that we can face with confidence because we have a reference point, right? And we have our faith. Faith that even though we can't see the end of the journey, we know where it's headed because we see the pile of rocks stretching behind us to help plot our course. And perhaps that's what faith is anyway. To journey looking backwards into the future. So this week, as you consider the events of now a Thanksgiving past, consider the blessings of the past. Consider where you are and who you are and whose you are. And know that God has been with you in the past, and you know where you are in the present. And so then you can draw a line from past experiences to where you are now to plot your path for the future. It's very comforting because you realize then you're just not out there floating around without a purpose and a point. You're here for a specific reason. You know God has been with you in the past. You know where you are now. And so you head into a future that, yes, is uncertain, but not without doubt, because you know that your future path will eventually lead you to the arms of the Savior you're here to worship today. So this week, I do encourage you to not only give thanksgiving for the blessings that God has provided you, but to remember some of those specific blessings where, for reasons completely unexplainable, you absolutely know for a certainty that God had His hand in that moment. And if you remember those events and know where you are, you can then know that you have a certainty in your future.